This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Dan Morrison from Abilene Christian University. Today, we speak with Rebecca Scofield, Kristin Haltinner, and Matthrew Grindal, three faculty from the University of Idaho, where the state legislature recently passed a law that denies state funding to public K-12 schools, colleges, and universities that indoctrinate students with critical race theory. Dr. Scofield is chair of the Department of History and Associate Professor of American History at the University of Idaho. Dr. Haltinner is Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the Academic Certificate in Equity and Justice. Dr. Grindal is an Assistant Professor of Criminology in the Department of Culture, Society, and Justice. They join us to talk about academic freedom, critical race theory, and teaching and learning. Our discussion was recorded on September 15th, 2021. Stay with us. Well, Kristin, Rebecca, and Matthew, I really appreciate your time, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while, so thanks for joining us on the Annex.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's get right into it and start with the basics. How would you all define critical race theory, a topic of some controversy these days? And why do you think this topic is gathering so much attention right now?
We should have decided who could talk about which one first. I can go ahead. So critical race theory is not new, really emerges from legal theory, which is maybe more in the weeds than we need to get. But in short, for this conversation, I think it's fair to consider critical race theory a framework for understanding contemporary racial inequality. And what's important about it, and I think key to this discussion, is the way that it recognizes how historical policies and practices affect the present. So if I can give you a quick example, that might be helpful. So if we're talking about something like the racial wealth gap, I'm teaching about it this week in my race class right now. Popular conversation about wealth inequality in the United States tends to blame individuals for a relative lack of wealth or culture, right? And Newt Gingrich infamously said that Black children should get jobs as janitors at their school because he believed that Black people lacked a particular work ethic, for example. So this is sort of the popular narrative. What critical race theory offers us, and really sociology and history more broadly, is a context for that. So when we look at the racial wealth gap, we see that things like slavery, that Jim Crow, that certainly disadvantaged Black people in acquiring wealth, while on the flip side, white people were literally given land through the Homestead Act that they could then use to build their family's wealth. And we can see how that continued to the present, right, where we have, following World War II, Black returning GIs were unable to access benefits of the GI Bill that gave white GIs low interest loans in the suburbs, and Black people were denied access to suburban land and instead forced to rent in cities. And then you can see how redlining emerged from that. And so what critical race theory does is provide an accurate contextualization of American racism and racial inequality, as opposed to falsely blaming people for their relative lack of wealth.
So I would add to that, too. I think one of the things that makes, and I obviously agree with everything that was said, but I think one of the things that makes a lot of the institution, so I would define critical race theory largely as an examination of the institutional policies and practices that perpetuate racial inequality. And one of the things when we take a look at those policies and practices is that they appear to be overtly colorblind oftentimes. But because they build on these historical legacies of racism, they wind up having very disparate racial outcomes. So for instance, the process over the last 50 years of economic restructuring, the shift from, and this is something William Julius Wilson has written about, the process of economic restructuring, shifting from an industrial economy to a service economy, has had an adverse impact on poor people of all races. But it had an even more adverse impact on the African American community because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. These African Americans traditionally were provided very poor educational resources. So those industrial jobs were almost literally their only source of social mobility. So when economic restructuring occurred and we shifted to a service economy where you pretty much need an education to be socially mobile, African American communities were adversely affected far more than other groups of color or just other racial groups, period. So even if you take a look at something like economic restructuring, which on its face doesn't really have any overt signs of racism, when it builds on the historical racist legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, you can see how that specific policy can have racist implications. And I think that's been a very important insight developed by critical race theorists.
I think I'm starting to understand a little bit more about how sociologists and other folks who teach about the legacy and continuing effects of institutional disadvantage, inequality, white supremacy, those sorts of things get implicated or get connected to this idea of critical race theory as some kind of threat to perhaps dominant racial groups, and a legacy that wants to be an ideology that wants to be colorblind and really deny some of the effects of these inequities and racial injustices that persist to this day. And as a person who teaches sociology and race courses, I love also the historical connections that you're making, Dr. Scofield, to this conversation. I think we need to. My opinion is we need to teach in sociology more history and put these disciplines in closer contact. So let's talk a little bit about that second part of this. Like, do you have a sense? Do any of you have a sense of why critical race theory is an issue right now? Dr. Haltinner, you talked about how critical race theory is not at all new. It's been around in the legal academy for decades. Perhaps originating with Derek Bell and others. But why today, over the last couple of years, let's say, has this topic become so controversial in our political life?
Yeah, I think this is just the new framework that's being used to attack critical thinking in schools. I don't think it's a new practice. I'm thinking about, and I might get the year wrong, so this is perhaps bad podcasting, but I think it was in 2010 when Texas made a number of changes to their school curriculums restricting what could and could not be taught with regards to slavery. I think there was even something about like framing it as a positive thing, if you recall this. So there's historically been very offensive and incorrect teaching about the history of race throughout American schools. I mean, we have a very solid reputation of reframing history to ignore the terrible things that have happened. So I don't think this is new. I think this is simply a repackaging of that same attacking of critical examination of history.
I mean, I imagine there's discomfort, right? I mean, I teach in a predominantly white institution. We have quite a few students of color, Black folks and Latinx folks as well. But it's probably, I don't know if this is common for you, but teaching about race and racism does make a lot of people uncomfortable, right? Because they have been taught not to see race, and I'm using scare quotes here, or to downplay, the significance of racial inequality in our lives, in our society. And so, is part of this, do you think, like an emotional reaction to bringing up issues of racial injustice and white supremacy that folks have wanted to either sublimate kind of or deny, in public, deny under this like colorblind, some kind of liberal ideology that CRT as an academic theory really argues against in some ways?
One thing I would add to that is, of course, critical race theory has been around since the 70s, and it's always, I think, to a degree, posed a threat to traditional conservative values such as individualism, meritocracy, because it says if you practice those ideologies, but you don't account in the practice of those conservative ideologies, you don't account for the institutional practices that perpetuate racial inequality, then those conservative ideologies are actually operating to minimize the importance of those racial inequalities as they manifest. Because, I mean, we know racial inequalities, be it wealth, crime, they exist. And if you don't explain it through these institutional practices, just as I mentioned, economic restructuring, things like that, then you're kind of left with scary explanations, accounting for individual differences, accounting for cultural differences that have overtly racist implications. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, there is, because the idea that, look, if you take colorblind ideologies such as individualism and meritocracy, and you don't count for these racist institutional practices that critical race theorists talk about, then those conservative ideologies will effectively will contribute to those racist practices. And I think that that's a threat. I think that poses a threat to conservatives because their ideologies are being questioned. And I think in the last 4 or 5 years, with the increased political polarization, with Donald Trump taking office, those threats have become a lot more salient. And I think you're seeing conservative politicians acting on them with divisive concepts, legislation including what was passed in Idaho.
I want to also just mention that I think, or I don't think, I know, that studying race is liberatory for white people, for all people, right? We often focus on how people are afraid to learn about race, but, I tell my students from the first day that, we're going to be learning a new language here. We're going to be learning how to talk about something that our culture doesn't let us talk about, and we're going to study it as a social scientist. And doing so is going to be liberatory. It's going to allow us to work together to re-envision a social structure that's more equal. And so, we end the class by looking at fantasy fiction by like Jemison and others, who are really exploring this question of what kind of world could we have, but by rejecting the sort of popular explanation for inequality, as Matt's talking about this individualistic narrative, we're able to consider radical reform. And that is what's scary for conservatives, right, who are rejecting critical race theory. They don't want people to radically re-envision society because they're the ones who are benefiting from society as it's currently structured.
I mean, what you're making me, first of all, that sounds awesome to read speculative fiction, to talk about the kind of world that we might want to put as our vision out there. I mean, when I talk about this in class, I talk about it in terms of actually an inclusive, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, where actually everyone, all citizens, right, are equally, listened to, right, heard, have a stake in the actual outcomes, instead of what we have, it seems now, which is a politics that's dominated by a relatively small portion of our population that really denies kind of some of our fundamental things that we say we value as a society. But of course, the practice has never lived up to the rhetoric, as we know.
Right now,
well, maybe this is a good. Go ahead.
So right now in my class, we're interrogating this concept of social citizenship, which is, sort of a sociological concept that looks at citizenship not simply about your civil rights, but your inclusion in the sort of social fabric of a country. I think Nancy Fraser and others have written about this. And so my students are really playing with this idea of how people of color continue to be denied social citizenship in the United States, both overtly and subtly, right? So you can think about things like how, Obama's citizenship was questioned as the president of the United States, sort of this perpetual resistance, like, oh, well, he's not American, he's not white. Or when people encounter what many people call microaggressions, but what Ibram X. Kendi refers to as racial abuse, when people ask someone where they're from and then reject their identity answer, right, or their answer and say, no, where are you really from, right, which doesn't let someone define themselves. And so we're playing with those ideas in class for exactly the reasons that you're outlining.
Well, maybe this is a good time to talk about the new laws that have been passed. So as of early August 2021, 9 U.S. states have either enacted bans for teaching critical race theory or, quote, indoctrinating students with critical race theory in public schools. And a few states like Idaho, Oklahoma, and Iowa, but not only those, apply these policies to public colleges and universities. What can you tell us about the new law in Idaho? Where did it come from? What does it cover? What's the status in your state now?
It's kind of ironic. So the law explicitly equates critical race theory with teaching of racial supremacy, which is mind-boggling because that's not what critical race theory does. And so the actual law prohibits teachers from teaching that one race, sex, or religion is, quote, inherently superior or inferior to another. And then it goes on to talk about how basically you can't make people feel bad for being a particular race or religion or sex, none of which critical race theory does. So it does explicitly say critical race theory in the law and equates it with the teaching of supremacy, but doesn't actually outlaw anything that's in critical race theory.
I do think it's really, the indoctrination is a really interesting concept, right? Especially because I think in most of our classrooms as sociologists, what we're trying to do is actually get students to critically examine a text, to ask questions about it, to sort of question its logic, its premises, its conclusions, the evidence. Is this a good argument? Does the author support it with reasonable evidence? Is the method sound? Those sorts of things. If we're indoctrinating, I would say it's into a scientific community that has a set of kind of standards, right, for adjudicating what is good scholarship and what is less good scholarship, right? Versus some kind of racial ideology, which would be explicitly outlawed by the law that you're talking about. But also, of course, if we're going to outlaw racial ideology, I've got some in mind that we could get rid of.
Yeah, in my classes, I intentionally use readings that I don't agree with, so students can see how it's important to read things that you don't agree with and to think about them critically and either allow them or don't allow them to change the perspectives that you hold. And I think this is sort of a personal pet peeve I have, but this perception that things need to be fairly balanced, right? And how that is misunderstood. So I was on a panel last year talking about Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And the panelists were made up of people who were race scholars, who studied race. And a number of conservative attendees thought that we needed to basically have someone who didn't believe in racism on the panel in order to make it fair and balanced. But that's not fair and balanced. Fair and balanced isn't when you add someone who doesn't know anything about a topic to a panel just because they disagree, right? Fair and balanced is when you have a number of experts approaching a question from a different perspective. And so when we have conservative state legislators trying to tell us what to teach, this is a severe overreach and a threat to academic freedom.
What you're saying actually sounds like, it's definitely a threat to academic freedom and a threat to the status of expertise at the University of Idaho and other educational institutions in the state. It sounds like it's a kind of a fundamental attack on the project, right? The project of critical inquiry that challenges powerful people and institutions, ideologies, structures, institutions in ways that are central to the teaching of sociology, other social sciences, history, gender studies, all kinds of things that many of our listeners do professionally. This is about power, right? I did want to follow up on this idea of feelings. And it seems to me that when these conversations come up, like whose feelings we're protecting is often unstated, but very much present in these laws. So, for example, like teaching the facts of redlining and residential segregation and lack of school integration, school resegregation. If that makes, for example, a white student feel bad, perhaps learning those things actually makes a student of color feel recognized and affirmed in their experiences, right? They're given some language to understand how it is that they got into a school that was 90% plus students of color like them, whereas another school maybe in the same town was equally ethnically or racially homogenous, but in the other direction, right? Or in another direction. And so I'm constantly struck by whose feelings we are protecting and the trade-offs that we as society in terms of public policy are willing to trade off. It seems to me like, the feelings of people of color are often the ones that are on the chopping block when we're preparing or when we're protecting the feelings of our majority, white students or white populations.
I also talk to my students about feelings quite a bit in the classroom. Ironically, I think white people would probably not feel bad about learning these histories had they learned them as children and were introduced. I mean, I have a 5-year-old, right? So we talk about this stuff all the time. And he's aware of our country's history and how race works as much as a 5-year-old can be. And it's certainly an example of white privilege that most white kids don't learn those things when kids of color have to learn how to navigate a racist world from infancy. But as an aside, so in my classes, I talk about feelings and I say, this might make you feel a particular way. It might make you feel bad or sad or guilty or shameful, regardless of your race, right? It might also be shame evoking to know that your ancestors were treated badly, right? The shame can run in multiple directions. And I encourage my students to consider reframing or repackaging that into a sense of responsibility. So these things happened in the past, and we are living in an unequal world as a result of them. But we are all here together to do this work to make it better. And so we have a responsibility as the inheritors of this social problem to solve it. And I think that reframing is really helpful for students to move through guilt or shame and into action and agency.
So within a lot of these divisive concept bills that are passing various state legislatures, it's one of the divisive concepts that's oftentimes brought up is making people feel guilty for the actions of their ancestors. And as Kristin points out in her class, and as I do in mine, we don't frame it that way. We frame it in the sense as, of course, you're not responsible for the actions of your ancestors, but those actions, those historical actions, have led to an unequal world, which white people benefit from. And it doesn't mean you have to feel guilty about it or terrible about it or take the blame, but we frame it as we have to come together responsibly and try to find a way to end these institutional patterns of inequality and end the institutional practices that foster it. And it seems that the way, and this is no surprise given how, the politically polarizing context within which this discussion is happening, but it just seems to be that the portrayal of critical race theory and these so-called divisive concepts is a straw man of what we're actually doing in the classroom, or even denying their very identity as activists. I mean, if you take a look at how conservative media portrayed, the BLM protests in the summer of 2020 versus, let's say, for instance, the January 6th protests, it's almost like they even want to not just deny their right to protest, but when they do protest, to mischaracterize it as violence or rioting.
Well, I love how we've opened up so many important and fundamental issues in terms of democracy and citizenship and engagement, and really empowering, as Dr. Haltinner said earlier, about empowering students to be actively engaged in their role as citizens. Maybe it'd be helpful to hear the story about how the issue of CRT came to be on the Idaho legislature's radar. Like, if it's something external to Idaho, if it's not really being taught extensively in schools, especially K-12 schools, mostly isolated to university classrooms. And truth be told, there aren't a ton of universities in the state of Idaho. What's the catalyst for this bill itself?
So there should be a distinction made here, and I'm not trying to minimize the prevalence of the bill that we're having to work with now, but I believe, so the current bill we're having to work with now, HB 377, is a kind of ban on, across the different state legislatures in the U.S., there have really been two types of bills that ban the, quote, indoctrination of, quote, divisive concepts. So I think the wording HB 377 uses is shall not directly or otherwise compel students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to any of these particular beliefs, but otherwise permit the teaching of the concepts, insofar as the teaching doesn't involve this type of indoctrination. With the more extreme bills that have been passed, I think in Oklahoma is one example, but in a few other states as well, the more extreme variant involves just an all-out ban of any teaching of the concepts, regardless of whether or not it involves indoctrination as it's so defined. And that bill, there is currently a variant, that kind of all-out ban in the Idaho state legislature. It's HB 352, which, at least according to the the bill numbers appears to have been introduced first. So I don't know if this gets at your question, but the thing that worries me most is, as challenging as dealing with the current bill is, the fact that if the growing political sentiment, let's say, to act on critical race theory and act on these, quote, divisive concepts, if there's more inertia for that built up, let's say through the lieutenant governor's task force on this issue, that bill, HB 352, might eventually wind up on the governor's desk to be signed. And that, I think, would be really disastrous for higher education because, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't talk about the institutional practices that are oftentimes hidden under this idea of colorblind ideology and that perpetuate these racial inequalities, if you're not allowed to talk about those, then in that vacuum, explanations of racial inequality wind up resorting to cultural inferiority, individualistic explanations, and things like that, which I think would be disastrous for race relations in this country. So, as challenging as dealing with the current bill is, it could potentially be worse. And that's, what I'm concerned about. But to answer your question, I don't think you can ignore the broader national context within which this is occurring. But if you wanted to answer like within context of University of Idaho, that's occurring within the broader national context, the actions of a libertarian think tank by the name of the Idaho Freedom Foundation have published reports, I think in the end of 2020, early 21, documenting, it looks like through content analyses of the Boise State and Idaho websites and their press releases, have documented, quote, social justice ideology themes in the policies of the universities, the curriculum of the universities. And it's, I won't go off on a tangent, but I can if you want me to. Some of that research is just
embarrassingly poor.
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to be polite. So it seems that, what they're trying to get at is this type of indoctrination, this notion that, and they are actually, fairly accurate in terms of describing what, a social justice ideology is, in terms of kind of saying that society is made up of powerful and the powerless, and institutional and structural practices, structural arrangements help to perpetuate that. And we need to diagnosis, and then we need to diagnose where those exist and then work to overcome those and correct them. But then when they go on to identify those practices in our curriculum, it seems like they code anything as a social justice ideology that even mentions social factor or any social characteristic, then it is automatically coded as a course that propagates a social justice ideology. So, for instance, the one I found that I mentioned yesterday to some folks is that within our criminology program, we offer a course on gender and crime, which was identified as a course in their report on University of Idaho. And they highlighted the first sentence of the course description, which says uses criminological and sociological theories to understand the relationship between gender and crime. And that was reflective in their analysis of a social justice ideology. And I'm like, that is one of, the gendered nature of offending and victimization is incredibly well documented and one of the most well-researched questions in the field of criminology. Yet that's considered a social justice ideology. It's almost as if you make any, at least in the Idaho Freedom Foundation's report, if you make any concession to social factors contributing to a social problem as opposed to individual factors or what have you, even if you are not using social justice rhetoric to explain why that problem exists, then you are considered propagating a social justice ideology. And that's just mind-boggling. I just don't get it, because sociologists have been doing that for 100 years. They've been identifying that. That's just one example. That was one of the worst ones. But are they basically saying that social justice ideology is any concession to explain the presence of a social problem is social justice ideology? No, not at all. And even pointing at one to gender, the course description doesn't even get into themes like patriarchy and possibly gender-related social justice themes. It just talks about the relationship between gender and crime. And that was coded as reflective of a social justice ideology. So it was a bit mind-boggling to me. And it just seems that they start out with, at least from a conservative point of view, this idea that we're going to try to spot examples of this ideology, but then they just go nuts reporting any mention of social factors. So in any event, those reports, I'm sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent, but those reports from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, I think were themselves inspired by the national context we've spoken about. But I think then those reports in turn help provide the impetus for the bill that was passed and the more extreme bill that's currently in the legislature.
So Dan, I think you had asked about the timeline of how this sort of happened, and I'm not entirely clear on that, but my understanding is that the Idaho Freedom Foundation, this independent think tank, which is run by people who, as Becca mentioned, sort of claim to be libertarians, but don't fully reflect libertarian ideology in their practice. So they developed this 39-page report about the University of Idaho, and as Matt is saying, it's poorly done. I mean, they inaccurately name our department, for example. They didn't include my race class, which is quite frankly very hurtful because that class is rich with social justice content. But they also handpicked things to address, right? So they talk about how we have a women's studies or a women's center on campus, but they failed to mention that we also have an organization called Mobilizing Men. And so they're handpicking things to use as examples. So if a student in my class turned it in, they would have failed. It was bad. But nonetheless, this report happened at about the same time that Boise State had an allegation against it in one of their freshman seminar courses that they were making white people feel bad. And it turned out that the person who made the complaint wasn't even in the class and had no evidence. And then they had an independent entity, evaluate what happened. And it turns out that the allegations were false, that nothing happened. But the university still lost $400,000 in state funding as a result of the controversy. And so I think all of this together has really galvanized sort of resistance to critical teaching or critical thinking in schools. And it's really infuriating because at the same time, the universities have done very little to create a counter narrative. As institutions of higher learning, we have a responsibility to create a counter narrative to what's being said about critical race theory, but it's largely not happening from our institutions in the state. It's happening from a lot of independent groups, not necessarily in Idaho, but nationwide, like on social media, right? You see all of these conversations, such as this podcast. What is critical race theory? What is all this about? But the universities aren't taking a lead in creating that counter narrative. And so instead, people are really emboldened to continue to critique the university and the work that it's doing. Perhaps even more frightening is that after all of this happened, our lieutenant governor created a so-called education task force, which seeks to, quote, examine indoctrination in Idaho education. And so what they're doing is they hand-selected a number of far-right activists throughout the state, and they solicit stories of indoctrination from the public. They choose which stories to listen to and ignore those from our students that are telling them, in fact, they're not being indoctrinated. It's not clear what they're going to do with the results of this task force, but it feels very much like a McCarthy witch hunt, like they are attempting to name us so that we can be harassed by the public in much of the same ways. And I think this too makes K through 12 teachers extra vulnerable more than just university faculty. I mean, they can contact us, we are at risk, but the K through 12 teachers are the people that are really facing the brunt of this. And I think, and as Becca is saying, they have very little recourse and protection.
Well, and they live in the communities that they serve. I mean, so Moscow, right, as a town is not that big, right? There are larger cities in the state, and getting there can be, you got to get in the car, you got to drive and so forth, right? Versus like your local neighborhood school, which those teachers live in the community. They're accessible. Obviously they're community members. So your point about how the danger or the potential sort of fallout from this is not equally distributed, I think is a really important one to be monitoring.
Can I tell you one interesting side effect has actually been massive increase in the number of students who want to take our race classes. We typically offer one section of that class every fall, and we are now offering 2 full sections because there was such demand this year. And it's not an easy class to get into. You have to have taken several prereqs. There's been a significant interest on the part of students, and I think it's partially in response to the legislature. And I think it's also emboldened a lot of UI faculty to sort of double down on the content that we're presenting to students. So I, for example, added everything that was highlighted as dangerous, right? So the 1619 project, it's in there, right? All of these things that I didn't include in the past, now that they've been flagged as troubling, they are now added to the class, right? And so it's had some interesting unintended consequences.
Well, that sounds good. That sounds good. I mean, I think the so interesting, right, is that the fact that, going after this at K-12 actually puts, ironically sort of puts the conversation at the local level, and then parents ask their kid's teacher, and the kid's teacher says, I don't even know, what that is. And clearly I'm trying to teach your kid how to read and write so that they can get a job and contribute to society and be a healthy, positive, contributing community member, politically and otherwise. And this is getting in the way of doing my job and supporting your own kid. So thinking about, in some ways, sort of movement dynamics, right? Political movement dynamics is an important part of this conversation.
I think it's also worth mentioning, or it's important to remember, that racism is also reproduced in schools. And so, we're talking about critical race theory, but we're actually ignoring then the ways that students are taught to be racist in schools, not intentionally, but I worked with a number of students of color locally who have talked about, being asked to speak on behalf of all brown people in their classes, or who have been asked to write on essay topics that were quite frankly offensive and immoral. Yet, and this is sort of also masking that. So we're having this discussion about if schools are too progressive in their thinking about race, when we also have this other problem where they are perpetuating racist ideas.
Well, is there anything else you want to say about either how this law has affected your teaching or the teaching of colleagues that you're aware of, or how faculty or others are organizing for change or in response to these policies, in addition to what you've talked about, Dr. Haltinner?
I've done something similar where I have students look at the law itself, and then we ask some questions about, what's the catalyst for something like this, and putting it in sort of the context and the framing of our country's history around race and racism, and how this sort of fits into that, and how the underlying emotions that might drive something like this. So if you're used to experiencing privilege, equality feels like oppression, that kind of an analysis. And then it brings up great questions about political ideology, idea of libertarian politics versus, ideas about fascism or socialism and communism. So it fits into these conversations about what are these political ideologies and what does this law represent in those contexts.
Fascinating. Matt, anything else you'd add?
Oh, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, looking through my notes.
Awesome. Well, I think there's a lot more to be learned about this law and how it plays out over this year and in coming years. And I'm looking forward to keeping track of the Lieutenant Governor's task force, which I think will probably have some explosive or controversial stories to share, whether or not those are really cause for concern or not. Well, I heard that campus reform has a new list, so best of luck to each of you if you would like to appear on that list. But that's a different topic for perhaps a different conversation.
I'm going to be hurt if my name is not on that list.
Well, listen, I have really enjoyed talking with you about the situation at the University of Idaho and Idaho more broadly, the IFF, the Lieutenant Governor's Task Force, and the origins and effects of this law and policy. So thank you very much, Dr. Haltinner, Dr. Scofield, and Dr. Grindal. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to the Annex, a sociology podcast. The Annex is a project of the Queen's Podcast Lab from the City University of New York, Queens College. I'm Dan Morrison from Abilene Christian University. My thanks to our guests from the University of Idaho, Music for the Annex is provided by Lena Orsa.